It's rare to find a band whose approach to harmony is as unique as that of Cardiac's. On the surface, they may seem like just another hyperkinetic, anything-goes art punk band, but the closer you listen, the more their style seems to follow a rigidly conceptual structure. Yet, at the same time, this structure is borderline impossible to make sense of using conventional functional harmony concepts. So I'd like to analyze their song Dog Like Sparky from their seminal 1996 album Sing to God, and see if I can find an alternative harmonic framework for understanding their unique sound. I should mention that I only started listening to Cardiac somewhat recently, after receiving an impassioned email from one of my viewers who expounded at length on why they're worth listening to. So many thanks to Alan West for that push in the right direction. I'll put a link to Alan's own aptly Cardiacs-themed YouTube channel in the description. Anyway, let's move on to the music theory analysis. The opening verse section of Dog Like Sparky is actually pretty simple, but it plays an important role in setting up many of the song's overall aesthetic choices. Note that my transcription here and elsewhere isn't the song's full arrangement. Instead, I boiled everything down to a chord progression, which is mostly played on guitar, a vocal melody, and an auxiliary melody, which is at various times played on guitar, piano, etc. Let's take a listen. There are actually only two chords here, A major and B major, both voiced as plain triads. Together, these chords nominally fit into the key of E major, but everything about this section, from the specific placement of these chords to the melodic phrasing, especially the way the auxiliary melody leads into the downbeat of each even measure, suggests that A is the root note, making this a 1 major to 2 major progression in the key of A Lydian. It's not all that common to hear the Lydian mode as the home key in rock music. Its root tritone interval makes it sound pretty tense, to the point where it can be difficult to incorporate other chords without having them sound like a resolution to a more stable key. But Cardiacs love the Lydian mode, and they often use relatively static harmony to give it a feeling of tenuous stability. To that end, the Lydian mode's tonic A major chord itself underpins most of this section, with a melody that emphasizes chord tones. And when the melody does flirt with color tones, they move back to chord tones well before the section's single chord change occurs. Of course, as we'll hear later, Cardiacs also often use the Lydian scale as a melodic device among much more dynamic chord and key changes. The other conspicuous feature of this section is its unusual pattern of time signatures. To start with, the main rhythmic feel here is a triplet shuffle, and it was even kind of tempting to notate everything in a compound meter. However, this would result in some absurdly large metric counts, and there are actually a few places both here and later on in the song which switch to a straight rhythmic feel, so I stuck with using triplet notation instead. In any case, there's a clear pattern of alternating meters here. First a measure of 6/4 meter, whose last two beats are where we get that B major chord, and then a measure of some other meter, whose last beat contains that brief auxiliary melody. The other meters include, in sequence, 4/4, 7/4, 6/4, and 11/4. There doesn't seem to be any logic to this pattern, outside of maybe a general even, odd grouping, and I suspect that these meter lengths were just in service of whatever melodic choices the band dreamt up. This haphazard impression is also mirrored by a final 6/4 measure, which, unlike the other 6/4s, is not paired with another measure. Instead, it throws us off balance with an abrupt transition to the chorus. This is a much shorter section with simpler rhythmic and metric features, but it's full of unexpected chord changes which are a real challenge to explain. It's clear that these chords are no longer in the original key of A Lydian, and in fact there is no single key that seems to contain more than a few of them. Now you know why I didn't bother defining a key signature in my transcription. One thing you might have noticed, though, is that these are all major chords, voiced as before as plain triads. In fact, over the course of this whole song, we will encounter all 12 possible major triads. And moreover, the song only has two chords that don't fit this template, two minor triads, which are used pretty sparingly. This effusive use of major chords in highly unusual patterns is probably Cardiac's most distinctive technique as songwriters, but obviously we can't really assign chord functions to a progression that's this disjointed. Fortunately, I have an idea of how we can better conceptualize this kind of harmony. Let's try putting these chords on a chromatic circle of fifths. Normally, this kind of diagram is used to assess the distance between different keys. You might even see the key signatures written out at each position. This doesn't really have a one-to-one correspondence with chords. For instance, placing the verse's A major and B major chords on the chart like so fails to capture how they usually share a single diatonic key. But if we associate each position with a major chord instead of a key, it can be quite useful for seeing whether these chords fall into the same general harmonic neighborhood. In particular, a given major chord can fit into the same diatonic key as any other major chord that's 1 or 2 steps away. In Dog Like Sparky's rapidly modulating progression, these what I call codiatonic chord changes help to create a brief sense of groundedness amidst the chaos. So let's plot the chords of the chorus on this graph. The most obvious feature of this progression is how it seems to move around the whole circle. It returns to its initial C major chord by moving through increasingly sharp keys. In fact, this is actually a bit troublesome to notate consistently. In any given change, it seems simpler to add a handful of sharps than to abruptly switch to lots of flats, but technically this would make the end result an enharmonic B sharp major chord instead of C major. And on a second repetition, this would approach an A triple sharp major, which is obviously ridiculous, so instead we need to pick an arbitrary place to switch into flattened keys. Even the normal notation rules of functional harmony start to break down when exposed to Cardiac's unusual chord choices. But moreover, the continuous addition of sharps, regardless of how we notate them, leads to a perception of ever-increasing brightness. This is especially audible in the 2 largest changes, which modulate up by a major third, or 4 steps on the diagram. In a way, this puts the harmony of this section closer to the forward-thinking jazz of John Coltrane, whose song Giant Steps is literally named for this type of modulation, compared with any other more conventional rock music. Of course, there are a few other repeated movements in this diagram. Not just the 2 giant steps, but also these 1-step movements, which are analogous to either diatonic 1-5 or 4-1 changes, and these 2-step movements, which could be seen as diatonic 4-5 changes. Yet, despite these repetitions, the overall pattern is not perfectly symmetrical. In fact, Cardiacs could have used the 1-step and 2-step movements to create a perfectly symmetrical 8-chord progression, kind of like a bizarro world version of Dog Like Sparky. However, the symmetry of this progression is much more monotonous, and since every pair of adjacent chords here is codiatonic, the modulations sound much more gentle. Conversely, in order to accommodate these bold giant step changes, Cardiacs needed to sacrifice symmetry, even incorporating this one backwards flattening chord change. And ultimately, this gives the progression a lot more character. In particular, the first 3 chord changes have a distinct sense of acceleration. Its first 2 chords are codiatonic, then the 3rd chord entails a key change, but at least remains codiatonic with the previous chord, and finally the 4th chord's key change launches upward, outside of any codiatonic relationship at all. Yet, despite all these key changes, the repeated 1-step movements form a recognizable motif which divides the progression into 3 distinct harmonic regions, which also correspond to this section's 3 measures of 6-4, 6-4, and 4-4. These are further enforced by the melody, whose almost exclusive use of chord tones creates a corresponding motif. A couple short melodic runs are used to contain the few color tones, and in combination with the big key changes, these create opportunities for some unusual melodic choices. Both of these runs follow the Lydian mode of their respective chords, replicating the flavor of the verse, and then combined with the chord changes, they even flirt with whole tone and chromatic scales, respectively. One last thing, you may have noticed that when I first played the chorus, it began at a noticeably slower tempo than where it ended. Cardiacs use this tempo shift to heighten the dramatic impact of this section. The chorus is usually the centerpiece of a song, after all. The tempo shift also imitates the circular direction and carnivalesque mood of the chord progression, kind of like a merry-go-round slowly coming up to full speed. Anyway, after this progression repeats twice, the song returns to the verse, although this time it only plays the last 5 measures of the original pattern, 3 measures of 6-4, a measure of 11-4, and a final 6-4 measure. The other 2 verses that are played later on in the song also use this modified pattern. But moreover, now that we're graphing the song's major chords on the chromatic circle of fifths, we can use this to examine the verse's chord progression. 2 codiatonic chords aren't all that interesting by themselves, but the chord changes that transition into and out of the verse are actually pretty significant. Both use massive jumps, one that's 5 steps flat, another that's 5 steps sharp. Though at this distance across the circle, the keys are so dissimilar that they start to lose any specific sharpening or flattening sound, and rather just impart a more generic sense of harmonic contrast. Still, the intensity of these chord changes stands out somewhat among the song's many smaller modulations, which makes them perfect for marking transitions between sections. After this shortened verse, the song returns to the chorus and then on to a new 2-part bridge section. While the first part of the bridge has a new pattern of chords, it still retains a few motifs from earlier in the song. If we put these chords on the chromatic circle of fifths, we see 3 really obvious features. The first is that the transition from the chorus moves from B flat major to B major, another massive jump that acts kind of like a harmonic palate cleanser. The second feature is that the progression generally trends in a flattening direction with these 3 and 4 step changes, as opposed to the sharpening direction which dominates the chorus. It retains the 1-step sharp movements found in the chorus, but because these pairs of chords are closely codiatonic, they have less impact on the overall direction of the harmony. Nonetheless, this codiatonicity still provides a temporary reprieve from the rapidly changing key centers. The third obvious feature in this progression is in how it repeats. Unlike the chorus, it doesn't loop around the whole circle. Instead, it makes it halfway around and then jumps from C major back to B major. This is another 5-step massive jump, except now instead of occurring in between different sections, it's being used after each repetition of a single subsection. Combined with a metric pattern of 4-4, 4-4, and 6-4, whose 7 evenly spaced chords restart earlier than the 8-chord loop, which is more customary in rock music, this gives the bridge a somewhat more nimble impression than the chorus. The vocal melody even begins to mirror this newfound sense of agility. Its harmony still mostly focuses on chord tones, but now its rhythmic feel, originally an 8th note triplet shuffle, is largely replaced by quarter note triplets. Unlike the shuffle rhythm, these syncopate against the beat in a lively hemiola pattern. And then the auxiliary piano melody adds to the rhythmic variety by playing straight 8th notes. Together, these variations foreshadow an even more profound change in rhythm as the second part of the bridge ensues. Here, the rhythm fully embraces a straight 8th note feel, which is less playful and more aggressive sounding than the earlier sections. The metric pattern here is slightly more complex than in the first part of the bridge, encompassing a measure of 6-4, then 3 measures of 4-4, followed by a variation which adds 2 beats to the second measure, leaving space for an additional chord. Overall, much of Dog-like Sparky's metric vocabulary consists of these familiar 6-4s and 4-4s, but the unpredictable patterns which they're arranged into make the song's whirlwind of chord changes sound even more chaotic. The chord progression for this subsection actually takes a small step down in complexity, however. It opens on the C-sharp major, which, as expected, is a 5-step massive jump from the previous section's ending C major, but then we get a long chain of single-step flattening movements. The song's 2 minor chords also make a brief appearance here. We can add them to the chromatic circle of fifths alongside their corresponding relative major chords, and as it happens, this chord progression plays each of these paired chords right next to each other. Anyway, the codiatonicity of most of these changes gives this subsection a more comfortable, conventional sound, especially towards the end. In fact, we could bracket the last 7 chords here together into a single diatonic key, E major. Technically, it's even possible to assign chord functions to this section, though given the abstract harmonic approach of the song as a whole, this strikes me as a bit unnecessary. That said, from this more diatonic perspective, the movement from A major back to C-sharp major as the subsection repeats feels a bit like a shift from the E major's relative minor key, C-sharp minor, to its parallel major key, which is a fairly well-established type of modulation in rock music. Furthermore, this exact chord change also showed up in the chorus, and so its appearance here is able to maintain the song's general theme of big sharpening modulations, despite the rest of the subsection's milder harmonic flavor. The melody here is my favorite part of this song. It has an octave transposition between the first 2 pairs of notes, and then plays several chord tone-based arpeggios before ending on something that's more scalar sounding. It really encapsulates the way this progression starts on a big modulation and then flattens gradually before settling into more diatonic territory. And it's also catchy as hell. At this point, the bridge transitions back to the chorus. This is one of the few transitions which doesn't actually entail a massive jump, instead moving flat by just 3 steps. This is sort of understandable though. The more configurations a song's sections have, the harder it is to enforce really specific harmonic qualities in every transition between them. Anyway, after the chorus we get another verse, yet another chorus, and then another run through the bridge before the song gives us a completely different interlude section. This section is probably the least conceptually consistent part of the song, but this sense of contrast helps to keep things interesting. To begin with, moving from the bridge's final A major chord to this initial B major chord avoids the massive jump modulations that have typically been used as transitions. This milder chord change is also reflected in a progression that, much like the end of the bridge, is pretty much diatonic, at least for the first 6 chords, which fit into the key of B major. But just as we begin to settle into what feels like a more conventional rock aesthetic, the F-sharp major chord jumps all the way to C major. A 6-step massive jump modulation, especially odd since it's happening in the middle of a section instead of in between sections. This modulation's sudden lurch is magnified by the following 3 and 4-step movements. And even though the melody here focuses on chord tones like usual, it manages to twist them into some rather unsettling chromatic-sounding melodic shapes. A few single-step changes are also peppered in here, which preserves a touch of similarity to the rest of the song, but then the last 4 chords of this section are especially weird. First, there's a movement from C-sharp major to D-sharp major, pushing away from the B major key that the section seemed like it may have been returning to. The voicing of this latter chord is pretty strange, with the F double sharp in the bass and a sustained E sharp in the vocal melody above. This returns to the C-sharp major chord before jumping to F-sharp minor, which seems to have little relationship to any of the other chords in this section and whose minor quality seems almost out of place. Yet it's technically codiatonic with the initial B major chord that plays as the section repeats, and at the beginning of the subsequent bridge section. So in total, even though the interlude starts innocuously, it quickly mutates into some of the song's most paranormal dissonances. After this interlude, the song plays through another bridge, another chorus, another verse, and then a final prolonged chorus. Repeating these sections multiple times helps to entrain the listener to some of these more unfamiliar chord changes, but overall, it's these quirks that make Dog Like Sparky a perfect example of Cardiac's unique songwriting style. The main elements of this style include extensive use of major chords with simple triadic voicing, fast-paced modulations which elude functional harmonic interpretation, use of particular modulation shapes as motifs, irregular time signatures in complex metric patterns, and finally, chord tone-focused melodies that are given shape by the underlying progression. This concludes my analysis of Dog Like Sparky. If you have any questions, leave a comment and I'll do my best to explain.